The question is as on the order paper. In view of the number of honourable and right honourable members seeking to contribute to the debate, I have imposed a 7-minute limit on backbench speeches with immediate effect. Mr Peter Hain.
Mr Speaker, the honourable member, I think, spoke eloquently for the majority view in this House, as does this motion. Can I just briefly apologise for having to leave at 3:15 if the debate runs past that time, Mr Speaker, but for a long-standing speaking commitment. But I want to start off by saying that I'm not a pacifist. I was a cabinet minister when the decision was taken to invade Iraq. I was Africa minister when we sent troops to save Sierra Leone from savagery. But as a former Foreign Office minister responsible for the Middle East policy, including Syria, I'm vehemently opposed to British military intervention of any kind in Syria. We all share the Prime Minister's genuine anger at the humanitarian disaster. We all agree that Bashar al-Assad has become a callous butcher who, instead of responding positively to non-violent protests when the Arab Spring reached Syria in March 2011, drove his people into carnage and chaos. Russia and Iran have been culpable in the unfolding horror. So have the Saudis and the Qataris. But Britain, too, is culpable. We should have promoted a negotiated solution from the very beginning. Instead, we began by demanding Assad's unconditional surrender and departure. But calling for regime change meant chasing an unattainable goal at the cost of yet more bloodshed and destruction. So is the idea of supporting a rebel military victory. That was fatal. Britain should have offered a practical strategy to end a deepening civil war, because this was never simply a conflict between a brutal regime and the Syrian people. Assad and the ruling Shia, Assad and the ruling Shia-aligned Alawite minority form 1/10 of the population, and we're never going to give up power if it meant, as they fear, being oppressed by the Sunni majority, with Christians and other minorities similarly nervous about change. Together, those behind Assad amount to nearly 1/3 of the Syrian people. Add in the Kurds, and the total reaches around 40%. Few of them like Assad or his Ba'athist rule, but they fear even more the alternative, becoming victims of genocide, jihadism, or Sunni or Sharia extremism. This is not some simplistic battle between evil and good, nor is it simply a battle between a barbaric dictator and a repressed people. It's a civil war, and a highly complex one into which Britain treads at its peril. It involves Sunni versus Shia, Saudi Arabia versus Iran, and a Cold War hangover, the US versus Russia. By all means.
I'm most grateful to him, and I don't necessarily demur from a single word of his analysis of the complexity of the conflict. But what effect do you think it has trying to bring these parties to the negotiating table when the International Criminal Court makes it virtually impossible to manage any kind of orderly transition, let alone continuity, in the existing regime, as he seems to be suggesting might be one of the options?
I'll address that point in a minute, Mr. Speaker. Although regime change in Damascus could be the outcome of a negotiated solution, if, as the UK and the US were effectively doing, getting rid of Assad is set as a precondition for talks, the carnage will simply continue. Surely we should by now have understood from Britain's long and bitter experience of Northern Ireland that setting preconditions will prevent attempts at negotiation from even getting off the ground. The Prime Minister's good guys versus bad guys prism is hardly made credible by the presence of al-Qaeda fighters amongst the West's favoured rebels, nor by the barbarous murders of innocent Syrian citizens by some rebels. Other parties have started to intervene, such as Hezbollah, in turn dragging in Israel, another lethal development. The collateral impact of 1 million Syrian refugees in Jordan is especially dangerous. Iran will not back off because of its key interests. If the regime was somehow toppled, without a settlement in place, the country could descend into even greater chaos. And Russia fears that anarchy because, like the US and the UK, it has key strategic military, economic and intelligence interests in the area. For instance, Syria provides Russia's only Mediterranean port in a region where the US is well placed militarily. The only way forward is to broker a settlement, with Russia using its leverage to ensure Assad negotiates seriously. Like it or not, Russia is critical, as is engagement with Iran. Otherwise, a Syrian settlement simply will not happen. The guidelines for a political transition approved by the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council at the Geneva conference a year ago on the 30th of June 2012 still provide the best roadmap for a Geneva II. But the US, UK, Saudi Arabia and their allies must stop their present stance and help to implement it. Preventing Iran and also Assad from attending a peace conference means it won't even get off the ground. Transitional arrangements that reach the end point of democratization are crucial, but their pace must be negotiated, not imposed. However unpalatable, Assad and his henchmen may have to be granted immunity in order to get them to sign up, hardly worse than the continuing barbarity and devastation of ancient heritage. All state employees, including the ranks of the armed forces, must be allowed to keep their posts to avoid a repeat of the chaos caused by America's de-Baathification in Iraq. The UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon's call on the 9th of October 2012 for both a ceasefire and an embargo on more arms going to the opposition, as well as government forces, should now be heeded. A Yemen-type process may even figure. There, a hated president did not actually resign, but equally did not stand for re-election. This will all be incredibly tortuously difficult, and I understand that foreign ministers are seeking to grapple with this on our behalf. But what is certain is that UK policy was always going to fail. The Prime Minister began with a demand for regime change, which didn't work. Then he supplied communications equipment and other resources, which failed too. Then he tried to supply British arms and got the EU arms embargo lifted until cross-party opposition in Parliament made that a really difficult, if not impossible, task to achieve. Unless there's a radical change, all the hand-wringing and condemnation as atrocity follows atrocity is empty. 2 years after the Syrian uprising, it's time for Britain, France, and the United States to change course. They, as well as their allies, including Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, need to recognize that neither side is going to win the civil war now destroying Syria. Instead, a political solution has to be the top priority. Britain needs to work with its friends in the Syrian opposition and persuade them to go to Geneva with a credible plan for a compromise. Local ceasefires, access to humanitarian relief, and names of prospective members of a new government of national unity that will also include ministers from the current Syrian government. Together, they can initiate a process of constitutional reform for new parliamentary and presidential elections with United Nations observers. Only through mutual concessions by both the regime and the opposition can the people of Syria be saved from the current nightmare. And all of this is going to be incredibly difficult, as I said earlier. But it is the only way forward, I strongly submit, to the present policy and past policies which have got us into this awful mess.